Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. I was turning 5 years old in the fall of 1969 when one of the most astonishing things had happened just before that birthday had occurred. It would be on May 20th of that very same year that the world would be astonished as the 1961 vision of our president then, John F. Kennedy, was realized. America would be the first country in the history of the world to actually set foot on the moon. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of a wonderful book simply titled Rocket Men, which would chronicle that particular journey and everything that went behind it, leaving pretty much the reader astonished at the fact that one time they thought to themselves, maybe my goal would be to be an astronaut, but realizing that the task at hand is not as easy as it seems. And I'd like to welcome our guest to the Beyond 50 radio program, who is a former vice president and executive auditor of Harper Row and Hyperion. He's also been the publisher of several books, including The First Heroes and Thomas Paine, which also won the 2007 Henry Adams Prize. His writing has also appeared in Vanity Fair, Salon, Reader's Digest, and the New England Review. And I'd like to welcome to our program our guest today, Craig Nelson. And Craig, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Mexican food, coffee, and cigarettes. That was what was behind the space program back in the day, huh?
Yeah, I always try and get a feel for the environment, and one thing that's very specific to NASA at that moment was everyone ate chain food, Mexican food, and smoked cigarettes like mad, and drank coffee by the gallon. So that was the smell you had going to mission control.
Now, it's funny because I remember I was asked the question, can you name the three astronauts that were part of that mission? And it's funny how you can name Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, but then the other one just seems so elusive. Is that something that's pretty common whenever anybody's asked that question?
It sure is, and it's a shame because Mike Collins is one of my favorite guys in the history of NASA. He's just a terrific guy, and he really deserves recognition because he did his job perfectly.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about him for a minute, because I know that as this mission was about to be undertaken, he was actually on the verge of leaving NASA altogether, which was something you just didn't do. So what were the circumstances around that, and why he seems to be sort of that shadowed sung hero, if you will?
Well, if you look at the details of what they went through, the training regimen for these guys was just beyond belief. Armstrong was an astronaut for almost 8 years, and in that whole time he went on 2 missions. Mm-hmm. He flew twice over 8 years. So you're training nonstop. You never see your family. At one point, Buzz Aldrin has to look at his compass to remember whether he's commuting to Houston or Florida because he forgot while flying the plane. Collins, before the mission even took off, was offered a command position at a future Apollo flight, and he turned it down. So he essentially resigned from NASA before Apollo 11 even lifted off.
Yeah, it's just such an interesting story because, most children, especially back in that day when this had occurred, they thought, I want to be an astronaut. And I think what's beautiful about the whole thing is the fact that it recaptured the American spirit, because you kind of take a look at what was going on then. We had the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There was the assassination of Martin Luther King. We had Woodstock going on. We had the war in Vietnam, a very unpopular war going on. All of this, what seemed to be turmoil and chaos, but at the same time they were focused on something that was just so far beyond all that, that it re-brought, so to speak, the inspiration back to the American dream.
I really think that when you go back, the more you learn about the Apollo program and the birth of NASA and going to the moon, and the more you see how incredibly difficult, unbelievably dangerous, terribly risky, how it's inconceivable they did this with the technology they have, the more inspiring this story is. It makes you think human beings can do anything when you circumstances.
Now let's go ahead and talk about how NASA came to select the people who would be on this mission here, because what was incredible about this is you hear a lot back in the day about pilots and test pilots, and there's quite a contrast in that you talk about in your book. But the neat thing that I thought that you brought up that was so wonderful were all the female pilots, just the incredible female pilots. And that's kind of a part of history that sort of is glossed over, for us, parading men as the heroes, if you will, and realizing that there was a possibility in that time that women could have just as easily stepped on to the moon as the men.
Absolutely. There was nothing that really would have stopped it. Of course, the spaceships were very tiny, so to have a mixed-sex crew might be a difficult thing to pull off in the 60s, if not today. But there were a dozen female astronauts who had gone through the rigorous entry-level physical testing that NASA had, and had passed all of those tests when Eisenhower decided that you needed to be a military test pilot in order to continue. So their applications had to be rejected.
Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting, too, is you realize the ages. For instance, when you were talking in your book about the test pilot themselves, they were usually approaching the age of 40. So sort of the celebration of youth as we seem to see today, and, as you pass the age of 30, forget it, it's all over with. But that was actually the beginning in this particular case.
Absolutely. All three men were either 39 or 40 during this mission. They were all born in 1930.
Mm-hmm. Now, Craig, could you please describe what it took for a person to be not only accepted into the space program, but what it took to get to the level of actually being on a mission such as the one that landed on the moon?
Well, first, you had to be a military pilot, and Eisenhower had decided this because he wanted the astronauts to have security clearance because of relationships that might occur between NASA and the Pentagon. And he also decided it so that if people did not want to be astronauts, they could be drafted and forced to do it.
Wow.
The worry they had at the time, at the dawn of NASA. Then, by the Apollo program, when it turned out everybody wanted to be an astronaut, NASA upped the ante and said you not only had to be a military pilot, you had to be a military test pilot, you had to be a test pilot with an advanced degree in science or engineering. And this really opened up for me when I learned that the thing that Aldrin and Armstrong both took on their mission to the moon were slide rules, which was the era's geeky calculator. And people don't use slide rules anymore, I guess, but at the time it was a mark of that you were really a math or chemistry or science kind of guy if you ran around with a slide rule. To me, that really summed up the big difference between what Apollo astronauts were like and the image we have of astronauts from the right stuff of being daredevil, cowboy-type guys.
And that was something that, as you were describing in your book, the press had sort of a hand in creating that so-called image. And it was quite interesting because they were trying to make the astronauts, and personality-wise, more interesting as personalities than they were, but in fact, when you came to understood who they were, I think, more interesting than the press could ever actually unveil.
Absolutely. What's interesting to me about the astronauts is that they were depicted as being this uniform group, as being very similar. But in fact, they're very distinct from each other. And you look especially at what they're doing now, where for this anniversary, as far as I know, Armstrong and Collins aren't taking part in anything at all, and Aldrin is doing as much as he can. So just looking at the different ways that they're reacting to this today, you can see how different they are.
I know when you talk about Neil Armstrong in the book, I remember he was one of the biggest names when it came to landing on the moon. Everybody knows who that is. But this was a guy that he really didn't like talking about people. And when it came to the press and interviews, pretty much all three men were kind of standoffish, as you will, and they really just didn't like the press and PR all that much. Describe why that was.
Well, I think the best comment on this was Mike Collins said that asking astronauts what it was like to fly in space was like asking how did they feel while flying in space. It was like asking Christian Barnard how he felt while performing open heart surgery. Because what's going on with the astronauts is that they're working like dogs. Right. And some of them really almost entirely miss the experience of going to the moon because they're just working nonstop. While Armstrong and Aldrin had their moonwalks, they had a to-do list sewn into their sleeves so they wouldn't forget everything they had to do. And it really is just nonstop. And secondly, what test pilots are trained to do is to, under serious pressure, under very trying circumstances, very calmly report what the gauges and dials are saying in their plane as it's spinning out of control. So that's their entire background. It's not, describing the colors of the moon.
I know. I found that funny because it made so much sense that you have to stay so focused about what you're doing, and then to have some press guy come up to you and say, well, how did you feel about that? And just picturing Neil Armstrong like, are you some kind of an idiot? And you gave that kind of a flair to these characters, and it made them very interesting.
Yes, it's just impossible. I mean, my absolute favorite story about Armstrong and the kinds of things and his style is happened. One of the things that really struck me in this book was how incredibly dangerous all of this was, and it was really brought home when I realized that Armstrong came very close to being killed 3 times while working for NASA. Mm-hmm. And the most well-known moment was when he was training to land the Eagle lunar lander, and he was using this thing called the Lunar Lander Research Vehicle, which is sort of like a giant iron bed with a rocket motor on the bottom and a seat on top. And you would use this to practice to simulate landing on the moon. And one day, a gust of wind caught this thing sideways, and it started crashing towards the ground from an altitude of only 100 feet. And Armstrong had to bail out, and he only had 2/5 of a second to spare. And the machine blew up in a fireball, and he took off his flight uniform, and went back to his office and went back to work. And people had heard that the astronaut had almost died doing this. And they walked by, and there Armstrong was working, so they assumed it couldn't be him. And so later, he was asked, how did he feel about this? And he said, it's always a sad day when you lose a machine.
And he was just like that, too. It was so interesting to read about what a focused, determined, by the numbers kind of a person he was. And I remember as I was reading in the book that I think it was I can't remember if it was Mike Collins or Buzz Aldrin was teasing him about a comment that he was the mission czar. And he kept saying that, and finally, Armstrong says, I think we've had enough.
No, he didn't want anything. He didn't want any appearance of goofing off. And in fact, I think that there is a history of telling the story of Apollo 11, and everything that might have gone wrong is sort of, I don't say whitewashed, but it's sort of dialed down. You would think it was the most boring mission in history, that nothing ever happened, when in fact a lot of it was hair-raising. And I think that's because Armstrong feels that he was the commander of a pretty much perfect mission, so discussing all these near misses casts aspersions on that. Of course, I don't feel that way, but I think he does think that.
Mm-hmm. I think what's fascinating, too, is people who they know about the mission. We landed on the moon. That was a technological marvel, and it's just about as far as they go with it. But I'd like for you to describe the engineering behind all of this, because to me, this is what was amazing. In fact, there was a quote that you used in the book that talked about how, for instance, in Europe, those are the metaphysicists, but in America, those are the engineers, and that kind of is one of those things that set us apart in that department, because we've always had that curiosity to always improve on something to the point where we were actually able to land somebody not only on the moon successfully, but bring them back alive. And that's the beauty about this whole thing and what it took behind that. Talk about the research and the things you learned that kind of really opened your eyes to say, it's just amazing how much really went into this.
Well, one of the things that I thought was sort of missing in the previous books about the space program is the fact that you're dealing almost all of NASA is made up of engineers and scientists and test pilots and people from the military who came over from the ICBM division. And for the most part, they're sort of cool characters. And so many people who've written about this have left them being cool characters. And I really wanted to sort of dig into that and get a feel for what rocks engineers boats, I guess you have to say. And so learning about the early days at NASA and what they started with when they were planning to go to the moon is really something else. One of my favorite stories in the book has to do with the fact that because pigs share a lot of anatomy with human beings, they decided they were going to send pigs in space. And when you
so the Muppets were right about that, weren't they?
Absolutely. So when NASA sends you into space, it makes you a cradle designed just for you, sort of like an egg carton. And so it made these pig cradles, and it put the first pig on its back and strapped it into the cradle, and the pig died right away.
Oh, my goodness.
And the secretary said, you know, I was raised on a farm, and you can't put a pig on its back because the stomach fat will suffocate it. And that's what happened. So they had to give up pigs and switch to monkeys.
That's amazing. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And my other favorite story from these early NASA days is the fact that they used to have groups of women sitting in rows of desks, and they would take a calculation and divide it up into components and pass the components out to these women who didn't have math skills. They had workbooks with the various elements of the math done for them, and they would fill in the parts of their equation and give their material back to the overseer, who would reassemble the equation, and those women were called computers.
Mm-hmm. You know, and it's amazing to think when you realize that nobody had ever set foot on the moon, although they had probes, and some of those were unsuccessful, is how we came to know what we did in light of the ability to be able to land somebody, you know, to come from Earth, to land on the moon, and then to be able to take off and come back. And, you know, over the years, there's been a lot of silly little conspiracy theories here and there, and I remember one from a friend of mine many years ago. Did we really land on the moon, or was it all staged? And I thought, well, why would we create a hoax like that? That's just not how America works.
Yes, exactly. You know, it's very popular now to imagine that there's a conspiracy going on. And in fact, there's a new area of psychology where people are looking into why does someone want to believe in conspiracies. And when this happened 40 years ago, the only people who thought it was a conspiracy were the Russians and the Cubans. You know, and now when you go to any kind of discussion online about the moon landings, there's always a group popping in saying, you've been deceived, the wool has been pulled over your eyes, it was all fake. And the thing that's so funny to me about it is that a lot of these people who believe in this conspiracy, they use as their evidence the fact that their pictures that come back from the moon are strange, that odd things happen there. And you know, the answer is quite simple. Yeah, it's the moon. It's a very strange experience. It's not like here. So, and I just found that very funny.
Yeah, according to the Rocky and Bullwinkle show, it was those green moon men.
Right.
Now, you know, to be somebody such as these three men, you know, having the tremendous support team that they had to go through the kind of training that they did, you also have to remember, too, that these were family men as well. Just imagine the focus it takes and the potential sacrifice that the families made so that this mission was accomplished with not only, you know, the perfectness that it did, but the ability for these men to stay focused on the task, even realizing the sacrifice that it was beginning to drain on them. To be able to do that is just, to me, almost incredible.
Well, they really didn't see much of their families the whole time they worked at NASA. And in fact, one of the things I wish someone would do is really write a book about the astronaut wives, because to me, those women were really heroes in the fact that
absolutely
they didn't get any of the glory involved in any of this, and they were well aware of how dangerous all this was. And if something had happened to one of their husbands, there was money that they would get because of a Life magazine deal that they had made, but it was really nothing. So the fact that your husband is under this kind of constant pressure is incredible. And actually, some of them comforted each other by saying that if our husbands weren't astronauts, they'd be flying in Vietnam, and that would be even worse.
That for sure. Now, it's interesting to think, too, when they put all this together and as they came back, how the nation was in awe, and then we just continue to move forward. But I thought one of the most interesting things you brought up was how the Russians, we were in that Cold War, and this would be one of those things that would pretty much almost end that instantaneously. But the fact is that the Russian leader knew about the launch date even before Johnson did.
It's really fantastic how,
I'd like to know how you came to find that kind of information out.
Which one in particular?
The one how the Russian leader found out about the launch date even before Lyndon Johnson did.
I think what you're actually talking about is that they found out about the atomic bomb before Truman did.
Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. Because it was in that chapter because you were bringing up the Trinity experiment. Okay, you got it.
Yeah, they knew about the atomic bomb before Truman did because Truman didn't have enough security clearance as vice president to know about it yet. Mm-hmm. And the Russians had really great spies at Los Alamos.
Mm-hmm. So now, how is it that because sometimes you hear about the space race, but how we actually got ahead of the game, was it clearly because John Kennedy threw a vision such as this out there, and then that made us rise to the occasion, as the American experience, the American experience typically does?
Well, I actually think there were a number of factors that ended up making this happen. The first is the fact that Kennedy, during his term in office, tried at least 4 times to end the space race, to convince the Russians to go to the moon and explore the galaxies as a joint project. Mm-hmm. And Khrushchev didn't want the West to see how pathetic his military really was. He had used Sputnik and Gagarin and the Space Triumph in order to make the United States imagine that he had a much bigger military than he really did. So he had turned down Eisenhower's proposal of open skies to monitor each other's atomic weapons, and he turned down Kennedy's offer of a joint mission because he didn't want them coming and seeing what the true situation was. So a great deal of what I think happened is the fact that because of Kennedy's legacy, Johnson felt honor-bound to continue to get to the moon, and he was in office until '68, so he could keep that going. And a number of times they tried to talk Johnson out of trying to make this date. And he told specifically his budget director that he owed it to Kennedy to do it.
Mm-hmm. It's just an incredible story when you read something, when you read Rocketman, you realize that there's a lot more than, the typical stories that you hear about, as you were mentioning earlier, the right stuff sort of an attitude, hard drinking, hard driving, partying type guys, but then, when 8 o'clock comes in the morning, click, and then they turn into astronauts. But, it's really a true story about people and how collectively they realized not only the danger that was involved, but the possibilities all at the same time. And to bring that kind of inspiration together and be successful, it just makes it all such an incredible story.
One of the things that I think NASA did that was very interesting from a management point of view was they sent the astronauts on tour to the manufacturers who were making various parts of the craft, mm-hmm. so that the guys, putting together the gas tanks, the liquid oxygen tanks, and the guys putting together the insulation would realize that human life depended on their work. And the result was that it dramatically escalated the quality and productivity of the materials they were producing for this mission in an astounding level. And it's sort of a smart thing to do, I think, in the future that another manufacturing concern could use that technique.
And what's even more fascinating, too, is you think about how they had to check and double-check and redouble-check, and it just goes almost infinitum. And then finally the thing is, now we need to discover all the things that we haven't thought about that we need to be able to solve. And I remember the movie starring Tom Hanks where such a situation had happened where they were losing oxygen inside the capsule. Said, here's the parts we have, gentlemen. We've got this much time to figure out how to change what's going on up there. And you realize just the kind of big brain working that goes on into something like this.
Yes, it's really incredible. When they finally received all the different parts of the spaceship from the different manufacturers and assembled it at Florida at Kennedy, the the run-through checklist amounted to 30,000 pages by the time you got to Apollo 11.
Mm-hmm. Amazing, amazing stuff. I remember I had the opportunity to be able to see both the space capsule as well as the actual spacesuits of these astronauts, and I thought to myself, I never really romanticized about being a kid who would one day become an astronaut, and I realized that at 6'4", that probably wouldn't have been a possibility then because they were such small, and I just realized how that must have felt, that sort of isolation that you would in such a small capsule, and to be able to endure something like that, the training must have been just incredibly rigorous to be able to stay disciplined enough just not to lose it.
Well, they were fantastically focused, and that's actually, I think, a key part of the what distinguishes test pilots is that they have this tremendous focus. But there is, of course, a big joke at NASA that the bravest man on any Apollo mission was the Navy frogman who opened the hatch at the end to let them out because the odor of three guys in space in this enclosed capsule gets quite intense, and the men inside would get used to it, but not the Navy frogman.
Oh my goodness. I'll tell you, it's a wonderful book, I think, for people who really want to get a deeper inside look, where it really, by the time, you're even reading the first several chapters, you feel, my goodness, you'd really have to be a unique person to be just part of this program alone. And I kind of wonder, when you take a look at the nature of the NASA space program today, do you feel that we're about as on track as far as our support for it as we were then, or do you think it's kind of changed and kind of been pushed to the side?
Well, on the one hand, we're not in the Cold War. So it's not part of a Cold War, and we don't have this immense competition going on with somebody else. So to look at the fact that we aren't doing things like Apollo anymore, I don't think it's really a decline. It's just that, we don't have massive helicopters flying over Vietnam either. It was that era, and it was a Cold War battlefield in a way. So that's one part. But I also don't know that Americans in general care about whether or not the country is number one in the world in science and technology as they did at that moment, partially because of the Russians' lead in the space race. And finally, I'm not sure how well NASA really explains what it does to ordinary Americans because, if you really look into it, you see these just incredible things that the agency accomplishes, and really what it does is just incredible and wonderful, not only with the robots it sends out and the Hubble telescope whose pictures we've seen, but in its monitoring of the Earth for agriculture and for climate change. It's just one fantastic achievement after the next. So I feel like those three things have combined to make people feel like the agency has deteriorated or declined when that isn't really quite true.
I know I've got a friend of ours, he just loves NASA and the space program, and he says, if there is one thing they need to spend more money into, based on what you just said, it is the NASA space program, for their ability to solve some of the really tough problems in so many different ways that we face here in the world, for instance, like global warming. And you realize the potential that we have there, but how we're kind of moving in a different direction because, as you had mentioned, America just doesn't seem to be that country that really cares whether we're the leader in science and technology anymore. And we seem to be caught up in things such as economics and there's the entitlement and all this. And it's almost like there's a spirit of America that was sort of put behind us in that time, but I know it's still underneath. It's just waiting for something to jump on here. And I'm kind of hoping that, with the 40th anniversary of this, that we'll just recapture that again and remember who we are. And, a wonderful book.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really incredible to me to really see how difficult this was, the sort of heroic achievement you have, not just from astronauts and wives, but from pad workers and engineers figuring out the answers to things, and the tremendous seat of the pants reaction that people had, where one thing after the next would happen, and they would figure out a way to fix it, even though they're 240,000 miles away. It's really a credible story, and I'm I'm so glad to have picked this as a subject for a book.
Now, what is going on around the 40th anniversary of this? Are there special celebrations? You said Buzz Aldrin was kind of doing some touring, and he's an amazing man all by himself because he's still tremendously physically fit, even at his age, as you had described in the book. He had a chin-up bar over his bed, so he was doing chin-ups before going to bed and after getting up, and he's still out kind of moving around and shaking and stirring. So what is going on out there with this?
Well, there's quite a bit going on. NASA is having various events in D.C., in Florida, in Houston, in Pasadena, and pretty much every significant science museum or planetarium is also doing something. So anyone can see what's going on in their local area and see some event. I'll be on a 6-city tour starting on Thursday myself, so I'll be in Chicago at the Adler Planetarium. I'll be at the Air and Space Museum in D.C. I'll be participating at a NASA history conference in Washington. I'll be at the Museum of the Air of the Rockies in Denver. So we're doing as much as we can to get the word out.
Mm-hmm. I know what's most compelling, too, and I'm possibly sure that you'll agree with this, Craig, is the fact that you look at the fact this was 40 years ago, and it's sort of like you might have a general attitude, yeah, we landed on the moon, I remember that, so what? But you realize that a book like yours and the celebration is in place because we want to re-inspire our young kids about the possibilities of the imagination. I mean, it's one thing that today when you realize, for instance, engineers, how they've made our lives, you now have a cell phone that you can get on an internet and get information about anything you want at any given time. And, you know, we grew up in the day when we still had the dial-up phone and you had to sit next to it to talk to anybody. And it's almost as though we've been taking technology for granted without realizing the imagination and the inspiration and the work that's behind it. I would think that something like this 40th celebration would help inspire a newer, younger generation to see the possibilities of what lies ahead, especially when it comes to the real American dream, which is the spirit of imagination and creativity.
Yes, I think when you hear that they went to the moon and each ship had a computer that was less powerful than a common cell phone, you really see what they were able to accomplish. One of the things that I also really like is when you go to see the spacecraft at the Air and Space Museum, they have Columbia, you can look inside and you can see all the things about it that were handmade because they didn't have so much CAD/CAM and so much robots working at that point. So you'll literally see yards and yards of wires, and they're held together with pieces of twine tied with these perfect little square knots that someone has done. And you see that all over the place. And another of my favorite stories is the fact that NASA had a term for engineering called LOL, and it didn't mean laugh out loud, it meant little old ladies. Because they had little old ladies putting together the spacesuits with glue pots. They were literally gluing together the interior of the spacesuits. And they had little old ladies weaving the ROM core, the memory cores of the computer were wires woven around these metal rings. That's how the memory was done, with sort of a magnet type of a thing.
Right.
And so that's how they manufactured both of those elements.
I'll tell you again, like I said, this is certainly a book that, you know, it'd be kind of interesting if teachers would kind of bring it into the classroom even as early as, say, 4th grade, 3rd grade even, and just recapture what we've done so you don't see them growing up just taking these things for granted, because it sort of dumbs down the imagination when you don't realize that I could create this. It's possible for me to be able to inspire other people. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be on our program today. I mean, just a fascinating story here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You bet. The book is Rocketman, and our guest today, Craig Nelson. And Craig, can you give out a website so people can find out what's going on with this celebration here, and they can find out more about you and the book as well?
Absolutely. It's craignelson.us, www.craignelson.us.
Very good. Well, Craig Nelson, again, thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel.
You bet. Book is Rocketman. Get that inspiration and that imagination open wide. I'm telling you, this will be certainly one to do it. You may not step on the moon, but you never know where the possibilities lie. All you have to do is just imagine where you want to go. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in today. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50 with a 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Also, be sure to visit us at our blog, where you'll find all of our archived shows, YouTube videos related to what we're talking about, and bunches of hot links for all the resources that you're looking for. Again, thanks for tuning in. I'm Daniel Davis. Remember, live your day past halfway.